On the Friday after Thanksgiving, in November of 1989, an 18-year-old college freshman named Mandy Stavik went out for a run. She was home for the holiday, in the tiny rural community of Acme, Washington, and she did what she did most days. She headed out along the country roads near her house, toward the Nooksack River, with her German shepherd, Kyra, running alongside her. It was an ordinary afternoon, a fit, happy young woman, home from her first semester of college, going for a jog with her dog. The dog came back. Mandy did not. Kyra returned home alone, without the young woman she'd left with, and in a small, close community where everyone knew Mandy. That single fact set off an immediate alarm. A search began, and 3 days later, searchers found Mandy Stavik in the frigid water of the South Fork of the Nooksack River. She had been abducted, she had been sexually assaulted, and she had been killed. 18 years old, home for Thanksgiving, taken on a jog she'd taken 100 times before. Her killer had left his DNA on her body. But this was 1989, and that profile matched no one. And in the decades that followed, as DNA databases grew, it went on matching no one. The case became the biggest unsolved murder in the history of that county. Investigators never let it go, and once a year they would sit down with Mandy's mother and promise her they were still looking. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where a killer hides for decades inside a small, familiar community until the science and a single brave act finally catch up to him, subscribe to Decades Cold and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. And here is what makes this case different from almost every other one we've told. It wasn't cracked by a family tree, or a database, or a lab technique. It was cracked because of one strange, glaring detail about a local man who had lived just up the road from Mandy. Over the years, as investigators worked the case, they collected DNA from man after man in that community to compare against the killer's profile, and people gave it, willingly, to clear their names, to help. But one man always refused. Every time, he found a reason not to give his sample. For years, that refusal sat there like a splinter, and eventually, investigators realized that if he would not give his DNA freely, there was another way to get it. The way it gets collected in so many of these stories. He threw things away. This is the story of Mandy Stavik, the dog that came home without her, and the 28-year refusal that finally gave a killer away. To understand this case, you have to understand the community it happened in, because Acme, Washington, is not a city. It's a small rural place in Whatcom County, up in the northwest corner of the state, near the Canadian border, the kind of tight-knit farming and logging community where families know each other across generations, where the high school is the center of town life, and where a tragedy doesn't strike a stranger, it strikes someone everyone knows. And Mandy Stavik was very much someone everyone knew, in the best way. Amanda Teresa Stavik was 18 years old, a 1989 graduate of Mount Baker High School, and by every account she was a genuinely exceptional young woman, the kind a small town is proud of. She was athletic, a runner, someone who took care of herself and loved being outdoors. She was a strong student. She was well-liked, warm, the sort of young person who seemed to have everything in front of her. She had just started her freshman year at Central Washington University, taking the first real step out into the wider world, and she had come home for Thanksgiving break to be with her family. Her mother, Mary Stavik, would later describe her in the simplest and most devastating terms a mother can use. Mandy, she said, was special. She really was. And you can hear, in the plainness of that, the enormity of the loss. Not a symbol, not a case number, but a daughter, a specific, irreplaceable girl who was the light of her family's life. When Mandy was killed, the grief was not confined to her household. It moved through the entire community. More than 900 people attended her memorial service in December of 1989. 900 people in a rural area gathering to mourn an 18-year-old. That number tells you everything about who Mandy was, and about the size of the wound her death left. And it tells you something else, something that would haunt this case for the next 28 years. Whoever killed Mandy Stavik was almost certainly someone from within that community, someone who might well have been among those mourners, someone who lived alongside the grief he had caused in a small town for decades. The afternoon of November 24, 1989, the Friday after Thanksgiving, Mandy went out for her run. She set off from home along the rural roads near the Nooksack River, listening to music on a Walkman, with Kyra, the family's German shepherd, keeping pace beside her. It was a route she knew. It was her own neighborhood. There was nothing about it that should have carried any risk at all. And then Kyra came home alone. For the people who knew Mandy, the dog returning without her was instantly, deeply wrong. Mandy was not the kind of person who wandered off, who lost track of time, who left her dog. The alarm was immediate, and a search for the 18-year-old began that same day. Family, neighbors, and authorities began looking for her along the roads and the riverbanks she'd been running near. The search lasted 3 days, and on the third day, a volunteer firefighter, part of the effort to find her, discovered Mandy's body in the South Fork of the Nooksack River. She had been in the water. The circumstances made clear that this was no accident, no drowning while jogging. She had been abducted from her run, she had been sexually assaulted, and she had been killed, and her body had been left in the river. Investigators would later note the grim possibility, based on the evidence, that she may still have been alive when she was put into the water. I'm going to leave the details of what was done to her there, because they don't honor Mandy, and they aren't what this story is about. She was 18 years old. She went for a run with her dog, in her own neighborhood, on a holiday weekend, and someone took her. The medical and physical evidence established the essential forensic facts the case would ultimately turn on. This was a sexual homicide, and that meant her killer had left biological evidence, his DNA, on Mandy's body. In 1989, that evidence was collected and preserved, and in 1989, it could not name a single soul. From the beginning, the nature of this crime pointed investigators in a direction that was, for a small town, almost unbearable to contemplate, inward. Mandy was taken from a rural road in her own neighborhood, in the middle of a holiday weekend, in a place where an outsider would be noticed. The overwhelming likelihood was that whoever did this was local, someone who knew the area, someone who belonged there, someone who could be near that road without drawing a second glance. That inference shaped the entire investigation, and it created a very particular kind of anguish for the community, because it meant the killer was, in all probability, one of them. A neighbor, a familiar face, someone who might sit near you at the memorial service, someone who might pass you at the grocery store, someone who had continued living an ordinary life in a small place, while carrying the worst possible secret. In a city, a killer can disappear into anonymity. In a town like Acme, he disappears into familiarity instead, into being known and trusted and unremarkable. And the Whatcom County Sheriff's investigators did not give up on finding him. This is one of the things that distinguishes the Stavik case, and it deserves real credit. This was not a file that got opened once and shoved on a shelf. For 28 years, the department kept working it, chasing leads, looking at suspects, responding to tips, and in one of the most quietly moving details of the whole case, investigators made a practice of meeting with Mandy's mother, Mary, once a year, every year, to reassure her that they had not stopped, that the search for her daughter's killer was still alive. Imagine what that meant to a grieving mother, and imagine the weight the detectives carried, showing up year after year to a woman whose daughter's murder they had not yet been able to solve. Sheriff Bill Elfo would later say it was likely the biggest case in the county's history, and that his detectives had worked it, in his word, doggedly. Over those years, one name surfaced and stayed, a local man named Timothy Bass. He had lived, at the time of the murder, just over a mile from Mandy, close enough to know the roads, close enough to belong. He was not a suspect in 1989, but as the years went on, he became a person of interest. And there was something about him that investigators could not get past. Here is the detail that becomes the spine of this entire case, and it's one of the strangest and most telling things you'll encounter in any of the stories we cover. As DNA testing matured through the 1990s and 2000s, it became a routine investigative tool in the Stavik case. Investigators had the killer's DNA profile from Mandy's body, All they needed was to compare it against the men who could plausibly have committed the crime. And the cleanest way to do that is simply to ask people for a sample, a cheek swab, a quick, painless test that, for an innocent person, does one wonderful thing. It clears you. It removes you from suspicion, permanently and scientifically. And so, over the years, many men connected to the case or the community gave their DNA voluntarily. They wanted to be cleared. They wanted to help find the person who killed Mandy Stavik. Timothy Bass would not. Again and again, when the possibility of giving a DNA sample came up, Bass declined, or avoided it, or found a reason not to. While the people around him were rolling up their sleeves to prove their innocence and help the investigation, he consistently would not do the one simple thing that could have cleared him, and investigators noticed. Because think about what a refusal like that means, in context. An innocent man, asked for a swab that would eliminate him from a murder investigation, has every reason in the world to say yes, and almost none to say no. The sample costs him nothing, and gives him everything. It lifts suspicion entirely. The person who refuses, over and over, across years, is behaving in a way that is very hard to explain innocently. That refusal was not by itself proof of anything. You cannot convict a man for declining a DNA test, and investigators knew that. But it was a signal, a persistent, glaring, unexplained signal, and it kept Timothy Bass at the center of their attention. Here was a local man who had lived a mile from the victim, who had drifted into the pool of persons of interest, and who would not take the one test that could have ended the questions about him. The problem was clear. The investigators were increasingly convinced they needed Bass's DNA, and Bass was never ever going to hand it to them, so they were going to have to get it another way. By the 2010s, Timothy Bass was living the kind of life that made him, on the surface, the last person a casual observer would suspect. He was in his late 40s, then around 50. He was married, with 3 children. He had a steady job. He worked as a delivery driver for a bakery, driving a route, dropping off bread, a familiar and unremarkable presence going about ordinary business. He had no criminal convictions. To most of the people around him, he was just Tim, a coworker, a neighbor, a dad, a guy with a delivery route. This is the same unsettling truth this channel keeps arriving at, and the Stavik case states it as plainly as any. The person capable of a monstrous act does not necessarily look like it in the years afterward. He can be a husband and a father. He can hold down a normal job. He can move through a community as a known, trusted, ordinary man. Timothy Bass had spent nearly 3 decades doing exactly that, living an unremarkable life in the same region where, the evidence would show, he had abducted and murdered an 18-year-old girl. And this is what made him so hard to catch, and what makes cases like this so frightening. The disguise wasn't clever. It wasn't an alias or a disappearance or a life on the run. The disguise was ordinariness itself. He simply kept living, quietly, among people who had no reason to look twice at the bread delivery guy. For 28 years, that worked. But the ordinary life had one crack in it, and it was the refusal. Everything else about Timothy Bass said, unremarkable local man. The one thing that didn't fit, the one behavior that stood out against the backdrop of an ordinary life, was that he would not give his DNA. And it was through that single crack that the whole thing would finally come apart. Because the investigators, unable to compel a sample and unable to get him to volunteer one, turned to the person best positioned to help them. Someone who saw Timothy Bass every single day, a coworker. In 2017, a Whatcom County detective working the case reached out to the place where Timothy Bass worked, the bakery, and made contact with one of his coworkers, a woman named Kim Wagner. And investigators shared with her the situation, that Bass was a person of interest in the decades-old murder of Mandy Stavik, and that they needed a sample of his DNA that he would never voluntarily provide. What Kim Wagner did next took genuine courage, and it is the human heart of this solve. She agreed to help. She began watching Bass at work, quietly, carefully, waiting for the moment he would do the thing every person does without thinking, discard something he'd had in his mouth, a cup, a can, anything carrying his saliva, and therefore his DNA. It's worth pausing on what she was actually taking on. This was a man she worked alongside, who the police had just told her might be a killer. She had to keep behaving normally around him, day after day, while secretly gathering evidence against him. If she was wrong, she risked accusing an innocent coworker. If she was right, she was collecting evidence against a murderer who saw her every day. Either way, it took nerve. Investigators had actually tried to tail Bass themselves for a night to catch him discarding something, and had come up empty. It was Wagner on the inside who was positioned to succeed where the surveillance had failed. And she did. Bass drank a Coca-Cola and used a plastic cup at work, and when he was finished, he threw them in the trash. The most ordinary act imaginable. Kim Wagner retrieved them. She pulled his discarded Coke can and the plastic cup out of the garbage, and she turned them over to the police. That was it. That was the whole break in a 28-year-old murder. A can and a cup, pulled from a bakery trash bin by a coworker brave enough to do it. The can and the cup went to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory, and the analysts did the comparison the entire case had been building toward for nearly 3 decades. They took the DNA from the saliva Timothy Bass had left on that discarded Coke can, and they compared it against the DNA the killer had left on Mandy Stavik's body in 1989. It matched. And it didn't just match in a vague or probable way. The strength of the match was staggering. The odds that the DNA on that can belonged to anyone other than the source of the DNA on Mandy's body were reported as roughly 1 in 11 quadrillion. A quadrillion is a 1 followed by 15 zeros. 11 quadrillion is a number so far beyond the human population of the Earth, beyond the number of humans who have ever lived, that it removes any reasonable doubt about identity entirely. This was not a partial match, or a close call. This was a scientific certainty. The man who had refused to give his DNA for years, whose coworker had finally taken it from a trash can, was the man who had killed Mandy Stavik. On December 12, 2017, Timothy Forrest Bass was arrested in Whatcom County, Washington, on suspicion of the murder, kidnapping, and rape of Mandy Stavik. He was around 50 years old, 28 years after an 18-year-old went for a run with her dog and didn't come home. The bread delivery driver who lived a mile up the road was in handcuffs, and the sheriff who had promised Mandy's mother, year after year, that they had not given up, was finally able to tell her they had made an arrest. Sheriff Elfo would call being able to deliver that news to Mrs. Stavik the highlight of a long career. Once Timothy Bass was arrested and confronted with the DNA, his story underwent a revealing transformation, the kind we've seen from cornered suspects in other cases, and it fails here in the same instructive way. Before his arrest, Bass had positioned himself at a distance from Mandy Stavik. He was just a local man. He barely remembered her. But now his own DNA had been found on her body, an undeniable 1 in 11 quadrillion fact that demanded an explanation. And a man in that position has only 2 options. He can admit what he did, or he can invent an innocent reason for his DNA to be there. Bass chose the second. He suddenly claimed that he and Mandy had been in a secret relationship, a consensual involvement that, he said, no one had known about. That, he suggested, was why his DNA was on her body. It's a specific and desperate kind of defense, because it tries to convert damning biological evidence into evidence of something innocent. If they were secretly together, the reasoning goes, then his DNA proves nothing but a hidden romance. But the claim collapsed under its own weight. For one thing, there was no evidence whatsoever that any such relationship existed. No letters, no confidants, nothing from Mandy's side, nothing from anyone who knew her. An 18-year-old's secret relationship with a local man leaves traces. This one left none, because it never happened. And the corroboration Bass offered made the story worse, not better. He claimed that the one person who knew about the supposed relationship was his own father, who, conveniently, had already died by the time Bass made the claim, and therefore could neither confirm nor deny it. A secret relationship, witnessed by exactly one person, who happens to be dead. It is the kind of explanation that is unfalsifiable precisely because it is untrue. The jury would see it for what it was. Timothy Bass went to trial for the murder of Mandy Stavik, and the case against him rested on that overwhelming DNA match. His own saliva, recovered from a discarded can, tied at 1 in 11 quadrillion to the man who killed her. The defense challenged the evidence, including how the DNA had been obtained and whether it should be admitted. But the surreptitious collection of abandoned DNA is well established in American law. Once you throw something away in a place like a workplace trash can, you have abandoned any expectation of privacy in it, and it is fair for others, including the police, to collect and test it. The can was fair game. The match was sound. On May 24, 2019, a jury found Timothy Bass guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Mandy Stavik. He was sentenced to roughly 26 to 27 years in prison. Nearly 30 years after Mandy went for a run and never came home, the man who took her was convicted and sent to prison. Bass has continued to maintain his innocence, and he pursued appeals, as convicted defendants are entitled to do. One of those appeals raised a technical issue about which version of a statute the trial court had applied to a crime committed back in 1989. The kind of legal question that can arise when you prosecute a decades-old case under laws that have since changed. An appellate court acknowledged there had been a technical error on that point, but found it harmless, because the jury had also found that Mandy's death occurred during a kidnapping, which supported the conviction regardless. The conviction stood, and the challenges to the DNA evidence itself were rejected. For Mary Stavik and for the community of Acme, the resolution came almost 3 decades late, but it came. The biggest unsolved case in the county's history was closed, not by a dramatic new technology, but by old-fashioned persistence, a DNA sample the killer refused to give, and the quiet bravery of a woman who reached into a trash can. The Stavik case sits a little differently from most of the ones we cover, and the ways it differs are exactly what make it worth studying. The first lesson is about the refusal, and it's a genuinely important one. In most of our cases, the killer is invisible because he's not in any database, a stranger the system has no way to find. Timothy Bass was different. He was known. He was a person of interest for years. The investigators' problem wasn't that they couldn't think of him, it was that they couldn't get his DNA to confirm what they suspected. And his own behavior, the persistent, unexplained refusal to give a sample, was itself a kind of evidence. Not legal proof, but a powerful behavioral signal. An innocent person, in a community desperate to catch a killer, generally wants nothing more than to be cleared. The man who won't take the test that would clear him is telling you something. In the Stavik case, that signal kept a guilty man in the crosshairs for years, until there was finally a way to get what he wouldn't give. The second lesson is about abandoned DNA, and it's the practical engine behind so many of these solves. We shed our DNA constantly, on cups, cans, straws, utensils, cigarette butts, anything we put to our mouths and throw away. And the law is clear. Once you discard it, it's no longer yours to protect. This is what defeats the killer who refuses to cooperate. He can decline every swab, exercise every right, keep his mouth shut and his sleeve down forever. And it doesn't matter, because he cannot stop shedding himself onto the ordinary objects of daily life and throwing them away. Timothy Bass never gave his DNA. He didn't have to. He left it on a Coke can, exactly as all of us would. And the third lesson is about ordinary courage. This case was not solved by a genius detective or a miraculous machine. It was solved, at the decisive moment, by a bakery worker named Kim Wagner, who was willing to do something frightening and uncomfortable. To watch a coworker she'd been told might be a murderer, and to pull his trash out of a bin and hand it to the police. She had no obligation to do that. She could have decided it wasn't her problem, that it was too risky, that she didn't want to be involved. Instead, she chose to help catch the person who killed a young woman she had never met. Justice for Mandy Stavik ran directly through that choice. A few things to carry out of this one. The first is about persistence. On every level of this case, the Whatcom County investigators worked this file for 28 years and never let it die. And they sat with Mandy's mother once a year, every year, to prove it. Kim Wagner watched and waited for the right moment to pull a can from the trash. The preserved 1989 DNA sat patiently in evidence, exactly as it was, until the day it could be matched. None of the flashier cases we cover happen without this unglamorous foundation of people refusing to quit. A cold case doesn't solve itself when the technology improves. It solves because someone was still standing there, still trying, when the moment finally came. The second is the strange, almost poetic justice of how Bass was caught. For 28 years he protected himself with a refusal. He simply would not give the sample that could damn him, and he had every legal right not to. He must have believed on some level that as long as he never handed over his DNA, he was safe. And he was wrong, in the most ordinary way imaginable, because you cannot refuse to shed your own DNA. You can decline the swab, but you cannot stop leaving yourself behind on the cups and cans of everyday life. Timothy Bass guarded the front door and left the back door wide open, the way everyone does, every day. His refusal wasn't a shield. In the end, it was a spotlight, the one strange behavior that kept investigators certain he was their man, until his own trash finally proved it. And the last thing is Mandy. Amanda Stavik was 18 years old, an athlete, a strong student, a beloved daughter, a girl her whole town turned out to mourn 900 strong. She went for a run with her dog on a holiday weekend in her own quiet neighborhood, and a man she may have known by sight took her life. Her mother waited 28 years, meeting with detectives once a year, holding on to a promise to learn who did it. When the answer came, it came from a bread delivery driver who'd been living a mile away the whole time, and from a coworker brave enough to reach into a trash can. It came far too late for the years Mandy should have had, but it came, and the man who took her is answering for it. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.